Hi students, today we are looking at Notes 2 of the Constitution Unit, which is titled Issues and Resolutions. It can be found on page 7 of your notes packet. Again, when you see the red wording and the pencil appear, please fill that out into your notes packet, and you will also occasionally see a highlighter, which may indicate that you want to highlight something in your important vocabulary. There were 4 main issues that the delegates had to deal with at the Constitutional Convention. The first issue was how should states be represented in the legislative branch? The legislative branch was the lawmaking branch, and they wanted to make sure that the people had a voice. The second issue that they had to deal with was how should the slave population be counted? The third is how the president should be elected. And the fourth was an issue with actually approving the Constitution. We're going to look at those issues and how they resolve those issues right now. So the first issue, which would be written in the chart on the bottom of page 7, issue 1 is how should states be represented? When they decided that the government was going to divide up into 3 branches, the one branch that was going to make the laws became known as the legislative branch. The issue, though, was how do we represent the people in the legislative branch? So, how many representatives should each state send to the legislative branch of government? Well, there were 2 big opinions. There were big states, like Virginia. Big states mean that they have a lot of population, a lot of people. And they wanted the states with more people to send more representatives to make the laws. The smaller states, and when we say small states, we're talking about ones with less population, said that all states should have an equal say in the lawmaking process. So what do? Do we represent based on population, or every state gets an equal number of representatives? The resolution was called the Great Compromise. What they decided to do is to take the legislative branch and divide it into 2 houses in Congress. One side, the House of Representatives, made the big states happy. More people in the state equaled more representatives in the legislative branch, specifically the House of Representatives. But they also said that the Senate should be 2 senators from every state, and that would give them equal representation. So right now we have 50 states, so we have 50 times 2 is 100 senators. But the House of Representatives remained based on population. So again, an important vocab term, the legislative branch is made up of 2 houses in Congress. That is the Great Compromise. Our next issue, though, is still based on the representatives from each state, is how should the slave population be counted? So, in the House of Representatives of the legislative branch, they're going to send people based on population. The southern states said, well, if that's the case, then you should count our slaves as part of our population. But the northern states said, no. If you don't recognize slaves as people, they should not count in your population. You can see how this would be a big issue. One of the main things with the southern states is that if they had more representation in Congress, they could protect their right to continue using slaves. And they were worried that if the northern states had more representatives, that they would try to get rid of slavery. So, how did they fix this? They resolved this with the 3/5 compromise. That means that 3/5 of the slaves goes towards your state's population. So for every 5 slaves, they would add 3 to the population count of their state. This sort of made the northern states happy. They didn't want to count the slaves at all, but they were happier with 3/5 instead of every slave being counted as 1. The southern states were happy because the other piece of this resolution was that Congress could not make any laws about slavery or the slave trade for 20 years. So the southern states felt like this protected their right for slavery in the South. The northern states had larger cities and larger populations, so they were happy that the slaves didn't get counted as full people in this situation. Couple of things to write there. I think you should be on page 8 of your notes. Okay, the third issue that we have is how should the president be elected? We're in the middle of page 8. How should the president be elected? It was a big issue because when they set up the executive branch, some of the people wanted one powerful person to be chosen by Congress to lead the executive branch. And the executive branch, if you remember from Minnesota studies last year, is the branch that enforces or upholds the laws. Congress at this time really felt that the average person wasn't qualified to elect a president. And the ordinary people said, wait a minute, if Congress gets to choose the president, then that person will only do what Congress wants. But remember, everybody really wanted the voice of the people to show through in our government. So how did they resolve this? They resolved it through the Electoral College. What that means is that when people vote, your vote goes toward your state elector, who then puts in their vote to the candidate who won the popular vote in your state. So there's so many electors for each state. And then what happens is we vote for who we want to become president. And then those electors place the vote for us, like on our behalf. Not all adults at this time could read or write. Women were expected to run a household and raise a family. So people said that the average person was not educated enough to be able to vote wisely. So they said the ordinary citizens can vote, and then the electors will make sure that that vote gets submitted in their favor. So that made Congress happy because every state had a certain number of electors, the same number as of their Congress members. And ordinary citizens were happy because the electors would give their vote to the candidate who won the popular vote in their state. As you're writing, you may be thinking, a lot has changed since 1787 that impacts the election process. Most of our citizens can read and write now. Women are allowed to vote. Minorities can vote. These are all things that didn't happen back then. It really back then was white landowning men that would do most of the voting and anything in politics. So things have changed quite a bit. And just a thought question for you is, do you think that people nowadays are more qualified to directly elect a president? I don't have those answers. I'm just throwing them out there for you as questions. So, to do a little electoral college math, basically, the electoral college votes are the representatives that the state has plus the senators equals how many votes. So, if you look at Minnesota, Minnesota has 10 electoral votes. That's because we have 8 representatives in our House, plus the same number 2 senators that every other state has. And that gives us 10 votes for the president. So in this year, which is an election year, you look at this map on the bottom here, and you can see that maybe it's most important for presidential candidates to win certain states. If you look at California, it has 55. Okay. If you win California, you have a lot of votes going your way. Okay. Minnesota's up there with 10. You look, see, Illinois with 20, Florida with 29. So some states are more important for the presidential candidates to try to win because that's more votes in their corner.
Every 4 years, Americans who are 18 or older have a big responsibility. Our votes decide who becomes the President of the United States. Unfortunately, the U.S. election system isn't that simple. This is electing a U.S. president in plain English. It's easy to imagine every U.S. citizen's vote being counted together on Election Day, but this is not the case. U.S. elections are not decided by the total or popular vote, but individual states. Let me explain. It starts with your vote. On Election Day, you'll vote for president and their vice president. You get one choice. Then, all the votes in your state are counted. The candidate with the most statewide votes becomes the candidate your state supports for president. This happens across the country until each state has selected their candidate. We end up with most of the 50 states and the District of Columbia voting to support one candidate each. But there's a problem. We can't elect a president by just counting up the choices of these states. U.S. states are different. Consider this. California has about 36 million people. Kansas has less than 3 million. We need a way for California's choice to have more influence on the election because the state has more people. The question becomes, how do we make sure each state has the right amount of influence on the election? Well, we need a way to account for the population of each state. As an example, let's consider my home state of North Carolina. Like every state, it is divided up into congressional districts that are based on population. North Carolina has 13 districts, California has 53, and Kansas has 4. When it comes to a state's influence on the election, the number of districts matters most. More population equals more districts equals more influence. The influence a state has in the election is measured by the number of electors. This number comes from the number of districts in a state plus the number of U.S. senators, which is always 2. North Carolina has 15 electors, while California has 55. When a candidate wins the voting in a state, they win that state's number of electors. That's why big, populous states can be so important to candidates. Their electors add up quickly, and the number of electors is what really matters. Here's why. If you add up the electors of all 50 states and the District of Columbia, there are 538 in total. The candidate's goal on Election Day is to win the majority of 538, or 270 electors. Once a candidate wins enough states to reach the 270 majority, they have won the election and become the president-elect. Yay! So, let's recap. Your vote helps your state choose a single candidate. That candidate receives all the electors from your state. The candidate who can win enough states to reach 270 total electors wins the national election and becomes the president-elect. Then, on the following January 20th, the president-elect is sworn in as the next president of the United States. And it all starts with your vote. Make it count. I'm Lee Lefevre, and this has been Electing.
Okay, so the last issue is how to approve the Constitution. When they went and they debated all summer and they wrote and rewrote everything until it was right, we still had some groups of people that disagreed with the Constitution as it was written. The two groups of people that stood out were the Federalists, who wanted a strong federal government. They supported the Constitution. They were happy about that. The Anti-Federalists wanted stronger state governments. And the biggest thing that they wanted was a Bill of Rights, so that the people would have individual rights specifically listed in the Constitution. So, on September 17th, 1787, the delegates declared that the Constitution was complete, but not everybody agreed, and so not everybody signed that day. How did they figure this out and resolve that? Well, the draft was published in newspapers, and the states would then spend the next year going over the Constitution and decide if they would ratify or approve the Constitution. To convince the Anti-Federalists, those who were against the signing of it, to ratify the Constitution, the Federalists agreed to add a Bill of Rights after the Constitution was approved. In order to approve it, they had to have 9 of the 13 states approve the Constitution to make it the new plan for our government. But because they promised that Bill of Rights to the Constitution, the Anti-Federalists were happy enough to sign, and then the Constitution became our plan for our government. In 1788, the Constitution was ratified or approved. Please put the Constitution was ratified on the front page of your packet on the timeline for 1788.